January 1942. A river of molten steel blazes through the heart of an American mill. Sparks leap like fireworks across the foundry floor. The air trembles with the roar of furnaces, the pounding rhythm of hydraulic presses, and the clang of hammers that never stop. Men in heavy goggles and soot-blackened faces guide ladles of glowing metal into waiting molds. Beside them, women in overalls inspect endless rows of machine parts, their gloved hands steady in the blinding light. Each bar of steel, each rivet, each bolt carries a single purpose: war. This is not a battlefield. It is something more powerful. From the ashes of the Great Depression, the United States has awakened. Its engineers, its workers, its machines, transforming scrap and sweat into the arsenal that will decide the fate of the world. The voice of President Franklin D. Roosevelt still echoes across the radios. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. The furnaces flare higher, because in this fire, the weapons that will defeat tyranny are being born. The world of 1939 stood on the edge of destruction. Across the Atlantic, Europe was burning. German panzers rolled through Poland with brutal precision, their treads crushing cities and armies alike. The Luftwaffe's bombers darkened skies over London and Warsaw. Mussolini's Italy marched into Africa, while Imperial Japan advanced through China, leaving cities like Nanjing in ruins. By 1940, the Axis powers seemed unstoppable. France had fallen in just 6 weeks. Britain stood alone, battered but unbroken. Hitler's armies stretched from the French coast to the gates of Moscow. In the Pacific, Japan's empire grew by the day. The United States, separated by oceans, watched and waited. A sleeping industrial giant not yet stirred to war. Inside America, memories of the Great Depression lingered. Factory lines were slow, steel mills half idle, and millions remained unemployed. Isolationist voices in Congress insisted this was not America's fight. But behind closed doors, a few leaders saw the storm coming. Among them was President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt understood something others did not. Wars were not only won by soldiers, but by the strength of nations, by steel, oil, machines, and mathematics. In December 1940, he went before the nation in a radio broadcast that would change history. His voice was calm but resolute. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself. Those words echoed through factories and farm towns alike. The call was not for soldiers yet, but for builders, welders, chemists, and engineers. America's battle would begin in its workshops. At that moment, the numbers were staggering. In 1939, Germany was producing around 8,000 aircraft a year. The United States, barely 3,000. Japan's shipyards were churning out destroyers and carriers at a rate unmatched in Asia. The Axis had spent years arming. America had spent years recovering. The gap was vast and terrifying. But something else was stirring beneath the surface. The U.S. still possessed the largest industrial base in the world, idle but immense. Massive steel works in Pennsylvania, auto plants in Detroit, shipyards in New York and San Francisco, all built for peace, not war. Yet within those same walls lay the hidden potential to outproduce the enemy tenfold. In the autumn of 1940, engineers from General Motors met with Army ordnance officers. They studied blueprints of tanks and artillery pieces, machines they had never built before. "We can make these," one foreman reportedly said, "but you'll have to teach us how to make them by the thousands." Soon, government contracts began to pour in. Civilian industries were offered new missions. A car factory might now produce aircraft engines. A refrigerator company could be retooled to manufacture ammunition. Everything depended on one resource: steel, the lifeblood of war. Scrap drives swept across the nation. Children collected metal toys, farmers donated broken tools, and families brought in rusted pots and pans. What once lay forgotten in junkyards became the raw material for tanks, bombers, and battleships. By mid-1941, the transformation had begun. Smoke once again rose from silent chimneys. Workers lined up outside factories that had stood empty for years. Wages climbed, morale soared, and the hum of industry filled the night air. America was not yet at war, but it was already preparing for one. Still, time was short. Across the Pacific, Japan watched with growing unease. In Europe, Hitler now eyed the Soviet Union. The world's balance was shifting, and soon, even the power of American industry would be tested in ways unimaginable. Because by the year's end, the unthinkable would happen. On December 7, 1941, the sky over Pearl Harbor erupted in fire. The morning after Pearl Harbor, America awoke to the sound of sirens, radio bulletins, and disbelief. The Pacific Fleet lay crippled, battleships burned in the harbor, smoke coiled into the sky, and thousands were dead. But the attack that was meant to paralyze the United States did something very different. It united it. Factories that had been converting slowly to war readiness now shifted into overdrive. The War Department called it total mobilization. There would be no distinction between military and civilian industry. Every machine, every engineer, every ton of steel now belonged to one purpose: to win. President Roosevelt formed the War Production Board, WPB, in January 1942. Its mission was simple but immense: to coordinate the manufacturing of everything the military would need: aircraft, tanks, ships, guns, fuel, and uniforms. Within weeks, new rules swept across the country. Civilian automobile production was banned. No new cars would be sold for the duration of the war. Instead, every auto plant in Detroit was ordered to produce for the military. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler turned their massive assembly lines into weapons factories. Ford's Willow Run plant became the largest industrial building in the world, designed specifically to mass-produce bombers. Its engineers took the same techniques used for cars and applied them to aviation, an idea once thought impossible. "We're going to build a bomber an hour," the planners said. By 1944, they did. In California, the Kaiser shipyards redefined speed. The Liberty ships, vital cargo vessels, had once taken 240 days to build. Under the new system, workers cut that down to less than 40. One was famously launched just 5 days after its keel was laid. The scale of this industrial revolution defied imagination. By the end of 1942, America was producing 48,000 aircraft, 24,000 tanks, and 56,000 artillery pieces, more than all Axis powers combined that year. Entire cities were restructured around war production. The population of Detroit swelled by hundreds of thousands. New towns sprang up around shipyards, steel mills, and airfields. But behind the machinery stood the human engine of the war effort. Women filled the workforce in record numbers, over 6 million by 1943. They operated lathes, welded hulls, and assembled wings. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter became the symbol of strength on the home front. African-American workers, long excluded from many industries, fought for and gained access to wartime jobs. Executive Order 8802, signed by Roosevelt in 1941, banned discrimination in defense industries. Though segregation remained, the war effort began to reshape the social fabric of the nation. Universities turned into research centers for the war. Scientists developed new alloys, synthetic rubber, radar systems, and improved fuels. Engineers reimagined logistics, creating conveyor systems capable of moving tanks, engines, and aircraft frames across entire complexes. Every American household felt the mobilization. Rationing became the new norm. Gasoline, sugar, rubber, and even cooking fats were limited. Victory gardens sprouted in backyards. Housewives learned to patch, mend, and recycle. Children collected scrap metal, rubber, and paper for the war effort. The propaganda was everywhere, but so was the pride. Posters declared, "Do the job he left behind. Waste helps the enemy. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler." America was not just fighting with weapons, it was fighting with willpower. By late 1943, the transformation was complete. What had once been a nation of consumers had become the world's greatest producer. Steel flowed from Pittsburgh to the Pacific. Convoys of tanks rolled out of Detroit. Bombers soared off assembly lines in waves. The United States had achieved the impossible. It had outbuilt the war, and yet this was only the beginning. Because beyond the machines and numbers lay something deeper. A story of innovation, human endurance, and the sheer genius of American engineering. The angles that would define victory itself. The war was not only fought on the front lines, it was engineered in blueprints, laboratories, and workshops. Behind every tank, plane, and battleship stood a vast army of American engineers and innovators who redefined what industry could do when Roosevelt declared that America must become the great arsenal of democracy. He gave no instruction manual. The task was monumental: convert a peaceful consumer economy into the largest weapons manufacturer in history, and do it faster than anyone believed possible. The engineers began with what they had: scrap steel, rusted equipment, and civilian tools. The nation lacked the sheer stockpiles of raw materials that Germany had seized from conquered Europe. Instead, American ingenuity focused on recycling and re-engineering. Scrap drives became a national phenomenon. Everything, from abandoned rail cars to farm plows, was melted down and reborn as armor plate or artillery shells. Across Pennsylvania's mills, engineers studied ways to purify and harden recycled steel, mixing it with alloys of nickel and chromium to meet wartime standards. Nothing was wasted. At the center of this effort stood the machine tool industry, the quiet, unsung core of American manufacturing. Machine tools, lathes, presses, and mills made it possible to build other machines with precision. Without them, no aircraft engines, no gun barrels, no tanks could exist. During the war, America produced 80% of the world's machine tools, giving its factories a level of output no rival could match. In Detroit, engineers at General Motors and Ford transformed automotive assembly methods into the architecture of modern warfare. Ford's Willow Run factory became an icon of industrial engineering. Stretching nearly a mile long, it used conveyor belts and jigs to assemble the B-24 Liberator bomber in continuous flow, an aircraft with over 1.5 million individual parts. The innovation was breathtaking. Instead of building one plane at a time, hundreds moved simultaneously down the line. By 1944, one fully armed B-24 was rolling out of Willow Run every 63 minutes. The factory alone outproduced the entire Japanese aircraft industry that year. Across the country, a new culture of problem-solving took root. Engineers worked 16-hour shifts, often sleeping in offices surrounded by blueprints. Women mathematicians calculated stress loads and wing tolerances. Draftsmen retooled civilian engines for tanks and submarines. Even typewriter manufacturers began producing machine gun components. The speed of adaptation stunned the world. When the Navy needed ships faster than ever, Henry Kaiser, a construction magnate with no shipbuilding experience, designed a modular assembly method that revolutionized maritime production. His team broke ships into prefabricated sections that could be welded together instead of riveted, slashing production time dramatically. The Liberty ships became the workhorses of the Allied convoys, carrying food, fuel, and ammunition across U-boat-infested waters. In 1943 alone, American shipyards launched more than 3,300 vessels, nearly one every 2 hours. But the real triumph was not just quantity. It was the standardization of quality at scale. Before the war, many factories built parts to unique specifications. Now, engineers designed interchangeable components that could fit seamlessly across different production lines and states. A tank engine built in Chicago could be installed in a chassis assembled in California. A bomber's landing gear produced in Cleveland could fit perfectly into an airframe built in Fort Worth. This interoperability, guided by strict engineering codes, allowed the United States to combine speed with precision. The results were staggering. Between 1941 and 1945, American industry produced 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 8,800 warships, 2.6 million machine guns, 41 billion rounds of ammunition. Behind every number was a story of problem-solving and innovation under pressure. Engineers learned to cast massive tank turrets in single pieces, eliminating weak seams. Metallurgists discovered new heat treatment methods to strengthen armor while reducing weight. Chemical engineers created synthetic rubber after Japan cut off natural rubber supplies from Southeast Asia. Even time itself became a weapon. Every production step was analyzed, shortened, and optimized. Stopwatches clicked beside conveyor belts. Efficiency was patriotism. This was engineering as warfare. Silent, relentless, and unstoppable. And yet, technology alone could not win the war. Machines could be copied. Innovation could be matched. What truly powered this industrial miracle was the human spirit. The will to create, endure, and outthink the enemy under unimaginable pressure. That story begins not with machines, but with people. The sound of war on the home front was not gunfire. It was the clang of hammers, the hiss of welders, and the thrum of engines. In the shadows of America's cities, millions of ordinary people became the lifeblood of the arsenal of democracy. Inside the vast industrial halls, the faces were new. Men who once built cars or refrigerators now riveted aircraft wings. Women stood shoulder to shoulder at assembly lines, their hair tied beneath kerchiefs, hands blistered but steady. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a poster. She was a million real women across the country, working with fierce pride. They entered a world that had once shut them out, proving that precision, endurance, and skill had no gender. Shift whistles replaced church bells. Day and night, factories ran without pause. Entire families adjusted their lives around production schedules. A father might work in the steel mill while his daughter inspected bullet casings on the night shift. In the cafeteria, they'd meet between shifts, exchange tired smiles, and return to their posts. The war effort dissolved old boundaries. Across the nation, African-American workers, long denied equal opportunity, found new ground in the defense plants. The Fair Employment Practice Committee, created under Executive Order 8802, forced industries to open their doors. In places like the Packard plant in Detroit and the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, black and white workers labored side by side, though not without conflict. The war didn't erase prejudice, but it exposed the hypocrisy of fighting fascism abroad while tolerating inequality at home. For many, this struggle became personal. The WWII campaign, Victory Abroad and Victory at Home, symbolized a new kind of patriotism. Men and women of color worked knowing that every shell, every bullet, was not just a weapon against Hitler or Tojo, but a statement of their own worth and right to equality. Immigrants, too, joined the effort with pride. Polish, Italian, and Jewish families, many with relatives suffering under Axis occupation, poured into war industries. English was spoken beside Yiddish, Polish, and Spanish on the production floor. America's diversity, once viewed with suspicion, became its greatest strength. Every community contributed. Children collected tin cans and rubber scraps from alleys. Farmers donated old plows, wagon wheels, even broken fences to metal drives. Schoolyards became collection depots for junk that will make tanks. Housewives saved bacon grease for munitions factories, its fat rendered into glycerin for explosives. The human cost of production was real. Fatigue and accidents haunted the night shifts. Factory floors were hot, loud, and dangerous. Some workers died in industrial mishaps never recorded in war memorials. Yet absenteeism remained astonishingly low. Patriotism and purpose kept them there. The belief that their labor could shorten the war, could save the life of someone's son or brother overseas. The emotional power of unity ran deep. Posters lined every wall. He's counting on you. Your work means victory. Keep 'em firing. Workers often pinned letters from soldiers above their machines. Thank yous from the front lines, stained by rain and smoke. These messages became their fuel, and when victory finally came, they would discover that they had done more than build weapons. They had reshaped the nation. Women had proven their industrial strength. African Americans had broken through the first barriers of opportunity. Scientists and engineers had forged the foundation for the post-war technological boom. In 1944, journalist Ernie Pyle wrote that the American soldier didn't fight alone. He fought with the help of 100 million hands that never held a gun. Those hands belonged to factory workers, welders, engineers, and mothers, who built the tools of victory from the scrap of a broken world. As 1943 turned to 1944, their combined effort reached its peak. Tank after tank, bomber after bomber, ship after ship, an unending flood of steel and fire rolling toward every front of the war. The output was so overwhelming that even the German High Command began to notice. Nazi Minister Albert Speer would later admit that Germany's greatest mistake was underestimating American production power. The people of the United States had achieved what no one thought possible. They had turned factories into fortresses and workers into warriors, the quiet kind who fought not with rifles, but with wrenches and willpower, and soon their work would ignite the decisive phase of the war, when this industrial torrent became the weapon that crushed the Axis on every front. By 1943, the thunder of American production had become a sound of war as loud as any cannon. The furnaces of Pittsburgh, the forges of Chicago, the assembly lines of Detroit, all roared in unison, synchronized by purpose and precision. The arsenal of democracy was no longer a promise. It was reality, a storm of steel, oil, and machinery rolling across oceans toward the enemy. The sheer scale was staggering. Every 5 minutes, an American factory produced a new truck. Every 10 minutes, a tank left an assembly line. Every hour, a bomber soared from a runway built beside its factory. By the end of 1943, America had built 85,000 tanks, 300,000 aircraft, and 8,000 ships, more than the Axis could ever hope to match. It was not just quantity. It was the coordination that made this machine unstoppable. From the ore mines of Minnesota to the shipyards of California, every rail car, barge, and truck was part of a synchronized supply web. Engineers in Washington tracked materials like generals tracked troops. Steel ingots cast in Ohio became armor plating in Michigan, were riveted into tanks in Illinois, and rolled onto ships in New York. The logistical network itself became a weapon. Convoys of trains thundered across the continent, carrying bombs, guns, and food to coastal ports. From there, fleets of Liberty ships steamed across the Atlantic, delivering the instruments of war to Britain, North Africa, and the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program. Under Lend-Lease, American factories not only armed their own forces, they armed their allies. Britain received thousands of tanks and aircraft. The Soviet Union was supplied with 400,000 trucks, 13,000 locomotives, and millions of tons of food and ammunition. Without those shipments, Soviet offensives like Stalingrad and Kursk would have been impossible. Adolf Hitler knew it. In 1943, he confided to his staff that Germany could not win a long war against such output. "The Americans," he said bitterly, "have a production capacity beyond understanding." Across the Pacific, Japan faced the same nightmare. For every warship Japan built, the U.S. built 6. For every bomber Japan sent into the sky, America launched 20. The Japanese High Command calculated that America's monthly shipbuilding tonnage exceeded their total annual capacity. Even as Japan claimed new islands, the tide had already turned, invisibly, through the weight of American steel. On the ground, soldiers felt the difference. In North Africa, General Eisenhower's forces were equipped with the new M4 Sherman tanks, reliable, fast, and repairable in the field. Pilots flew the P-51 Mustang, a marvel of aerodynamics and mass production that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory. Infantry marched with Garand rifles, jeeps, and radios that worked flawlessly under fire. Behind every weapon was a name, not of a general, but of a factory. Ford, Chrysler, Boeing, Douglas, General Electric, Bethlehem Steel. The battlefield had become an extension of the production line. The numbers defied comprehension. In 1943 alone, American industry produced 86,000 aircraft, 24,000 tanks, 8 million tons of steel per month, 2.4 billion rounds of ammunition. Germany, by comparison, struggled to produce even a third of that. Despite forced labor and captured resources, Allied bombers destroyed German factories faster than they could be rebuilt, while American plants worked untouched behind oceans. The war that Hitler had imagined as a contest of ideology had become a contest of endurance. And the United States had more of everything: fuel, steel, engineers, electricity, labor, and time. Roosevelt called it the greatest industrial achievement in the history of mankind. He was not exaggerating. The front lines began to shift. In the Atlantic, Liberty ships replaced those sunk by U-boats faster than the Germans could destroy them. In North Africa, American-supplied armies crushed Axis forces at El Alamein and Kasserine. In the Pacific, carriers built in the months after Pearl Harbor struck back at Midway and Guadalcanal. This was not luck. It was logistics. It was the power of thousands of unknown hands moving in perfect rhythm. As 1944 approached, that rhythm quickened to its peak. Entire divisions were now being equipped, shipped, and deployed with a speed no enemy could comprehend. The factories that had been built from scrap and ambition were now producing the future, a future that would arrive in Europe on the shores of Normandy. The war's decisive turning point was no longer a question of if, only when. By 1944, the American war machine had reached a tempo no enemy could match. The arsenal born from scrap steel and sweat was now global, a network of ships, trucks, tanks, and planes feeding multiple fronts at once. The United States wasn't just fighting a war, it was supplying one for the entire free world. And on June 6, 1944, that power came crashing down on the beaches of Normandy. The D-Day invasion was not just a military feat, it was a triumph of logistics. More than 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 156,000 troops crossed the English Channel in a single day. Behind every rifle and every landing craft lay years of planning and unrelenting production. Each Higgins boat landing on Omaha Beach had been designed, welded, and tested in American shipyards. Each tank that rolled off the landing ramp carried steel forged in Pennsylvania, rubber molded in Ohio, and ammunition loaded in Illinois. Every bullet that cracked the dawn sky was a testament to the engineers, who refused to stop building. The invasion succeeded not because the Allies had more men, but because they had more machines. Every fallen tank was replaced within days. Every lost aircraft had a successor already rolling out of a hangar somewhere back home. Germany, once feared for its mechanized armies, could no longer keep pace. The German commander Erwin Rommel, observing the invasion's scale, reportedly said, "When one sees the material the enemy has, one realizes the hopelessness of our position." The same pattern unfolded across the Pacific. By 1944, American shipyards were launching new aircraft carriers faster than Japan could sink them. The once invincible Imperial Navy was overwhelmed by sheer numbers and innovation. For every carrier Japan lost, America built 3 more. For every Zero fighter Japan sent aloft, 10 American aircraft replaced it. At sea, the industrial miracle became visible in steel and flame. The Essex-class carriers filled the horizon, each carrying nearly 100 planes. The B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber of its time, emerged from Boeing's production lines, a machine so complex that over 1,000 subcontractors contributed to each aircraft. These bombers would soon strike deep into Japan's industrial heart. Every island captured in the Pacific became an assembly point for the next. Engineers built airfields in weeks, harbors in days, and fuel depots that could support fleets. Portable steel runways, mass-produced back home, allowed bombers to launch from coral atolls never meant to bear their weight. The turning point was not just military. It was moral. American workers understood that their hands reached across oceans. They could see the war's progress in newspaper headlines and film reels, knowing their labor made it possible. Factories hung banners that read, "You're fighting on the production front." By 1945, the scale of production bordered on the unreal. The United States produced 125,000 aircraft in 1944 alone, 8,000 warships that same year, $40 billion rounds of ammunition annually, over 4,000 dollars. Tons of cargo every month shipped to Allied forces. No empire in history had ever wielded such industrial force. Germany's once fierce Luftwaffe was shattered under relentless bombing raids. Japanese convoys vanished beneath waves of torpedoes. Allied armies advanced with endless supplies. Every loss instantly replaced. Every need instantly met. In Europe, as American tanks thundered toward the Rhine, captured German officers stood in disbelief at the columns of vehicles stretching from horizon to horizon. They had assumed America's industrial abundance was a myth, until they saw it in motion. Even inside the Reich Chancellery, Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, confessed in despair. "Our production cannot compete with theirs. They build faster than we can destroy." By spring 1945, the full weight of that truth had crushed the Axis. Germany collapsed under bombing and shortages. Japan, its cities burning, could no longer feed its population or fuel its planes. The war had become a contest of exhaustion, and America never tired. When victory finally came in May and August of 1945, it arrived not just through courage or strategy, but through production. The relentless rhythm of machines, the hum of factories, the unbroken discipline of a nation united in purpose. The arsenal of democracy had done more than defeat fascism. It had proven that engineering, organization, and the human will, when aligned, could reshape the fate of the world. The furnaces that once glowed for war would soon cool, their silence echoing across an exhausted but victorious nation. But their legacy was just beginning, a legacy that would define the post-war world. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the smoke of war drifted above a world that barely recognized itself. Cities lay in ruins from Warsaw to Tokyo. Nations that had ruled for centuries were on their knees. But across the oceans, the factories of the United States still stood, humming, unbombed, and stronger than ever. the numbers told a story more powerful than any speech. In less than 4 years, America had produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, 5,600 merchant ships, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. No other nation in history had ever manufactured destruction or deliverance on such a scale. The war had cost unimaginable lives, but the machinery of victory had also preserved millions more. For every tank that rolled through Europe, there were countless trucks carrying food and medicine. For every bomber that struck Japan, there were freighters supplying liberated islands with fuel and grain. The industrial miracle had not just armed a war, it had sustained a planet. Historians would later calculate that American factories alone supplied 2/3 of all Allied war material. Without them, the Soviet Union could not have resisted, Britain could not have survived, and the Pacific could not have been reclaimed. But the cost was profound. The home front bore the scars of exhaustion. 12-hour shifts, rationing, and the constant pressure of quotas had tested the limits of the nation's spirit. Many workers, especially women, found themselves dismissed once the war ended, told to make way for returning soldiers. The riveters and welders who had built the arsenal of democracy returned home quietly, their roles in history often forgotten. Yet their impact was permanent. The war had rewritten the social contract. Women had proven their indispensability. African Americans, though still fighting segregation, had demonstrated that equality in labor was both possible and essential. Union membership soared. Wages climbed. The industrial unity that had defeated fascism began to redefine democracy itself. America emerged from the war as the only major power with an untouched industrial base. While Europe and Asia rebuilt from rubble, the U.S. held over half of the world's manufacturing capacity and produced nearly 2/3 of its oil. The global balance of power had shifted forever. Washington, once cautious and inward-looking, now found itself the economic and military center of the world. In August 1945, as the mushroom clouds rose over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world witnessed the ultimate product of industrial warfare, a weapon so advanced that it rendered the old order obsolete. The atomic bomb was the final expression of the same engineering genius that had built tanks, bombers, and ships at unimaginable scale. It symbolized both triumph and terror, the peak of human achievement, and its greatest peril. When Japan surrendered, President Truman addressed the nation. The power of production, of science, of free men and women working together, has brought us victory. That power now had to be redirected from war to peace. Demobilization began immediately. The War Production Board dissolved, factories halted military contracts, and assembly lines that once produced bombers turned back to making cars, refrigerators, and farm machinery. But this return to peace was not a regression. It was evolution. The innovations born from war transformed every part of civilian life. Aircraft technology gave rise to commercial aviation. Mass production techniques revolutionized consumer goods. Synthetic materials developed for tanks and uniforms became plastics, nylons, and fabrics that defined modern fashion. The United States entered a period of economic expansion unlike anything seen before. The post-war boom. The GI Bill educated millions of veterans, feeding a new class of engineers and scientists. Highways, suburbs, and schools grew from the wealth created by wartime industry. But under this prosperity lay a question that still echoes today. Could the same machinery that saved civilization also endanger it? The war had shown that industrial power could defend freedom or destroy it. It was not the machines themselves that held moral weight, but the people who built and directed them. And the world, now divided between East and West, would soon learn that the same furnaces that forged victory could also forge fear. The arsenal of democracy had ended one war, but its shadow would define the peace that followed. When peace returned, America faced an unfamiliar silence, the kind that follows thunder. The engines stopped, the furnaces cooled, and the men and women who had driven the arsenal of democracy looked toward an uncertain future. But within that silence lay potential, a chance to turn the power that had destroyed empires into one that could rebuild them. The conversion of wartime industry to peacetime production was one of the most astonishing transitions in economic history. Factories that had built Sherman tanks now rolled out tractors. Aircraft plants designed for bombers retooled to produce passenger planes. The same engineers who had perfected precision manufacturing for artillery began crafting medical devices, cameras, and computers. The momentum of war never truly stopped. It simply changed direction. American steel and engineering now flowed into Reconstruction. Through the Marshall Plan, the United States shipped billions of dollars worth of goods and equipment to rebuild Western Europe. Bridges, railways, and factories in France, Belgium, and West Germany rose again, often using the same materials and machinery that had once armed their liberation. This was not just economic policy, it was ideology made tangible. The U.S. believed that prosperity was the best defense against tyranny. By helping its former allies, and even former enemies, rebuild, it extended the reach of its industrial and political influence across the globe. The blueprint of victory had become the blueprint of dominance. Meanwhile, at home, the face of America changed. The wartime migration to industrial centers had permanently reshaped the country's geography. Cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and Los Angeles swelled with workers who never went back. Suburbs sprouted around these industrial cores, filled with families who traded ration books for mortgages. The culture of production gave way to the culture of consumption. Mass manufacturing, perfected during the war, now flooded stores with affordable goods. Cars, televisions, washing machines. The same spirit that once measured success in tonnage of steel now measured it in comfort and convenience. And yet, even in peace, the shadow of war lingered. The Cold War soon emerged, and with it, a new kind of arms race, one fueled not by desperation, but by industrial superiority. The United States' wartime experience had taught it a lesson that every rival would soon learn. Whoever controlled production, controlled power, military contracts returned, though under new names: defense spending, aerospace development, atomic research. The old factories hummed again, this time not for invasion fleets, but for deterrence. It was President Dwight D. Eisenhower, himself a general of that war, who later warned in 1961 of the military-industrial complex, a permanent alliance between government and industry born from those same wartime furnaces. It was both a warning and an acknowledgement. America's might, for better or worse, had become inseparable from its machinery. But beyond politics and power, there was something deeper, a cultural legacy forged in the heat of the foundries. The war had proven that collective effort could achieve the impossible. It had shown that science, engineering, and labor could unite under a common cause greater than profit or pride. That belief, that innovation and sacrifice could change the world, would carry into every field of post-war life, from medicine to spaceflight, from civil rights to technology. The same industrial ingenuity that built tanks would soon launch satellites. The same teamwork that assembled bombers would one day put men on the moon. By the early 1950s, the arsenal of democracy had evolved into something broader, the engine of modernity. Its reach extended into every corner of the planet, powering economies, reshaping politics, and defining what it meant to be a superpower. But even amid triumph, veterans of the home front remembered what had built it all. Not just steel or machines, but unity. The welders who had labored through the night, the engineers who solved impossible problems, the families who gave up comfort for purpose. Their hands had built more than weapons. They had built an idea that free people, when driven by necessity and conviction, could outproduce tyranny itself. In that sense, the real legacy of America's wartime industry was not just victory, it was transformation. From the ashes of global war rose a new world powered by industry, technology, and human determination. The world would never be the same again. In the end, the story of America's wartime industry is not just a tale of machines. It is a story of faith. Faith in the capacity of ordinary people to achieve extraordinary things. Faith in engineers who saw possibility where others saw ruin. Faith in a nation that believed its freedom could be measured not by conquest, but by creation. The transformation of scrap into power, of rust into resolve, revealed something timeless about humanity. It proved that progress is not born in comfort. It is forged in necessity. Every ton of steel, every rivet, every hour of labor during those years carried a piece of that truth. Factories once filled with noise and fire became monuments of unity. Each conveyor belt was a statement of belief that democracy, when organized and determined, could stand against the darkest forces of history. It wasn't perfection that won the war, it was perseverance. The workers who endured fatigue, the scientists who solved impossible equations, the leaders who turned fear into purpose. Together they demonstrated that freedom itself can be manufactured, if the will exists to build it. When the smoke cleared and the war was over, the world did not return to what it was. The foundries of the arsenal of democracy had reshaped not only geopolitics, but imagination. They had shown that power could be moral when guided by responsibility. That technology, when born of conscience, could be civilization's greatest defense. But they had also left a warning in steel, that the same tools that defend humanity can, if misused, destroy it. That paradox remains the legacy of the 20th century. The shadow and the light of progress intertwined. Today, the rusted remains of those wartime plants still stand in silence, their walls scarred by time. Yet if you listen closely, beneath the dust and echoes, you can still hear the heartbeat of a generation that believed in building its way out of darkness. They turned scrap into weapons, and weapons into victory. But more than that, they turned struggle into strength. And in doing so, they proved that the greatest engine of all was not made of steel, but of human will.